This interview is of Maurice L. Glover. The interview is taking place in Dallas, Texas at Maurice's home on March the 1st, 1996. The interviewer is Dr. Vernon L. Williams of Abilene Christian University, the Department of History. Maurice, if you would, tell us a little bit about where you grew up, who your parents were, a little bit about your family life.
Okay, I grew up in Gonzales County on a farm. My father was a farmer, a poor one at that, as most of them were back in those days. And I was there, lived on this farm up until I was 15 years of age. When I was 15, well, there was such a drought that our cotton and corn, none of it ever came up, so we had no money left and could not stay on the farm. We had to have some way of making money to buy groceries with. We moved down to near Houston with a relative of ours and stayed with them and picked cotton. The whole family did. I had two brothers and a sister, and myself, and my father and mother. After that, we stayed there, and my father started building houses. He had had some experience in building houses. This was in 1925 and 26. I went to school in a small town west of Houston, which was called Alief, A-L-I-E-F. It is now part of Houston. It's about 15 miles at that time out of Houston.
Give us the names of your parents and your brothers and sisters, if you would.
Okay, my father was D-O-T, Calvin Glover. And my mother was Althea, A-L-T-H-I-A. And her mother lived with us for quite a number of years in her older age. So I went to high school in Alief, which was just a small little town at that time. Now it covers a lot of Harris County down there. That's where I met Ruby. Ruby's middle name is McGee, and that she was named after a relative of mine, McGee, from the McGee family. That's where she got her middle name. We went together for about 5 years, and when she came 18, well, we got married. That was in 1930. At that time, I went to work for a retail furniture store in Houston because that was at the height of the Depression. And I was able to get a job there, making 12 and a half a week for a 60-hour week. Back in those days, you worked 10 hours a day for 6 days a week. Ruby was working for another furniture store, a competitor, as a bookkeeper. And she and I got married in November of 1930. Then in 1935, we had a daughter. That was the only child we had. That's all we could support back in those days.
What was her name?
Barbara Lynn. And then in 1938, the furniture store that I'd been working for all these years burned to the ground, and they did not stay in business, so I had to find me another job. And I found a job. I was a buyer for the furniture store, and found a job as buyer of the American Furniture Company in El Paso, which was the largest furniture store in El Paso. So we moved to El Paso. That's where our daughter was started in school, and in 1942, the draft was about to catch up with me, so I volunteered for officer training camp in the artillery. I was chosen. I went on service for basic training as a private, and after 6 weeks of basic training, then I was sent to the officers candidate school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma for the artillery. Did the entire course for the artillery, went out and was sent from there to Camp Hale, Colorado, the mountain artillery division. They didn't need any extra officers up there. I was sent there as a second lieutenant. They transferred me to the artillery division down in Camp Carson, which is right near Colorado Springs. And that was a mule pack artillery division. The officers carried an 80-pound pack on their backs up and down the mountains. And of course we carried our artillery on the backs of the mules. The artillery pieces would break down, the barrel would go on one mule and the breech on another. From there, I had about 6 months of that training, and that was about all I wanted of that, because I tell you, it was tough. When you come down a mountain with an 80-pound pack on your back, your feet are going to the front of your boots, and it really hurts. And you just can't get over that. And that was a tough assignment. You're in top physical condition when you get through with their training. In fact, you're just as tough as they can make you. And the pack artillery marched at a rate of 5 miles per hour, where infantry division marches at the rate of 3 miles per hour. So that was very physical. Then we'd go on a 25-mile march and really get our exercise with that pack. So I was sent to Pittsburgh, Kansas for my pilot training. I got accepted to go to the pilot training course, and I got my basic training with the Air. At that time it was the Air Corps, not the Air Force. It was still a division of the Army. After I finished my basic Air Corps training, Air Force training, I went to Fort Sill for the artillery pilot training, where you learned to undo all the safety rules that you were taught in the Air Corps.
Tell us a little bit about that first pilot training. What kind of aircraft did you fly, and how was that training set up in terms of ground school versus flight training and that kind of thing? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, during that detached service with the Air Corps, we were flying a half a day training and a half a day in school. They held the school in one of the high schools there. It was in Pittsburgh, Kansas. That's where we were. We were billeted in a hotel there, right near the high school. So we went to the school part of it in the morning. In the afternoon, we got our pilot training. And we were there 3 months. Then from there, as I say, we were transferred down to the artillery school for flight training, which lasted another 3 months. And in that flight training, we learned to land right on a very short runway over treetops. We learned to take off over barriers, which we had to be able to do on a short field. And when I finished that, I was sent. We got to choose the state that we could go to. So I chose Texas, but naturally being Texan, and Ruby and our daughter were in Houston with her parents. they assigned me to Camp Barclay at Abilene. And I reported in there soon, a couple of months after the division had gone to Abilene. And I was assigned to the 494th as a pilot there. And I was the senior pilot for the 494th, being a little higher in rank than the other pilot, just in length of service.
When you arrived at the 494th, who were some of the officers, the commanding officer, and some of your fellow officers that you got to know?
Well, of course, the commanding officer was, at that time, it was Major Harold Crawford. He soon became a lieutenant colonel, because that's what a battalion commander's rank was supposed to be, so they promoted him to a lieutenant colonel. Other officers was, well, one was Herman Nast, who was my observer flying. He was a second lieutenant. There was no MO as such for an artillery observer. They just had to pull an artillery officer from some other job to fly as an observer, which was quite unusual, the fact that you didn't have an MO for an observer, because that left them short then in where they pulled him from. Of course, Herman was with me on the morning that at Herlesham, the morning that we got shot down. And that plane, the 20 millimeter hit the microphone that we were transmitting a fire mission on, hit the microphone, and that caused it to explode in the cockpit of the plane, and it blew the tires out, it blew the windshield out, blew the microphone out through the left plexiglass window. And the observer was really wounded, spent 18 months in the hospital from the wound. He was sent to England for operations and all, and was there for a long time, and finally got back to the States. And of course he now lives in Corpus Christi. From that, after that, went on, I was shot down twice more.
I'll probably ask you some more detailed questions about that as we get further into that. But could you tell us how they had that, you arrived as the senior pilot. Tell us a little bit about how the three field artillery battalions were set up in terms of allocations of pilots, planes, crewmen, that kind of thing.
Okay, each air section had 2 pilots, each battalion, and then of course being three battalions, that gave us 6 pilots that flew for the battalions. In addition to those pilots, there were 3 pilots assigned to division headquarters, which were, well, they flew only in the case of an emergency, one of us that was out or something like that. And of course they were in command of what the battalion pilots were doing. And during the war over there in Germany, France, air section was completely separated from all troops. We had to pick a landing field every night, which was either a road or a field, wheat field or something. And we'd just move up there and land at night, each night, and be ready to go the next morning. In flying these artillery missions, we usually like to fly at about 1,200 feet. But in Germany during the wintertime, while we were there, the ceiling was usually about 200 feet. So we had to fly about 200 feet. Of course, all the ground troops were firing their rifles at us. And during my 175 missions as I flew, I came in 150 of them with bullet holes in the plane from the ground troops. Every time I'd come in, well, the mechanic would have to start patching holes in the plane. Each air section had the two pilots, two airplane mechanics, jeep driver, another vehicle driver, and we were assigned one anti-aircraft tank for keeping the enemy airplanes away from our airplanes. And that was our crew, and we, as I say, we were completely on our own.
What about maintenance?
Huh?
What about maintenance?
On the airplanes? Well, of course, we carried these two airplane mechanics right with us. We had them with us, and they carried spare parts, and if we needed other spare parts, well, they would have to go back to the supply depot and pick them up. And see, we had, the air section had two vehicles, a jeep and a personnel carrier that we carried out all of our equipment in, and spare parts for the airplanes.
What kind of aircraft were you flying?
Cub L4s. Yeah, that's all we had.
What about training in Abilene? How did that proceed, and how did that prepare you for combat?
Well, of course, the whole division went on maneuvers, and the air sections had to go on these maneuvers with them. Of course, there again, we were separated from the troops because we probably couldn't land our plane right where the troops were at that time. And we would fly artillery missions there and fire artillery, and out there at Camp Barkley, we flew quite a number of missions. Then we were down at Camp Hood for maneuvers down there. We're down there a couple of weeks in training. And then from there we came back to Abilene, and let's see, just preparing to get ready to go overseas. I joined the division in Camp Barkley in April of '43, and we left Camp Barkley in September of '43.
That'd be 44.
44? Yeah. Well, then I joined them in April of '44.
So you were only there a few months.
Right.
What about Ruby and your daughter?
They stayed in Houston with her parents, except during the summer when the daughter was out of school. The reason they stayed in Houston because I was moving around so much, and that's the only place they wanted to keep, Ruby wanted to keep her in school without moving around all the time. And besides that, Ruby was working. She was working in a defense plant, Hughes Tool Company.
Let me ask you about a couple of things regarding Barkley. During the time when Ruby was not there, April and May, for example, could you describe the BOQ facilities there at Barkley and maybe the battalion area where the enlisted men lived? If you could go back in time and look at that area, could you describe it in any way? Well,
of course, I lived on the base out there, particularly when Ruby wasn't there. And the officers' club was right nice building and well equipped. As far as the enlisted men, I really didn't have much contact with the enlisted men other than my two mechanics, which both of them were enlisted men. And being with the officers all the time, I didn't have very little contact which I was sorry that I didn't have, except a lot of them would, being in camp on the weekends, they all wanted to take, the enlisted men liked to take a ride in the airplane, so I spent most of the weekends just flying them around over the area there. And of course, one or two of the officers wanted to fly, and I took them up.
What kind of flight facilities, hangar, or in other words, where you kept the aircraft, how was that set up?
Well, that was on the parade field. We used the parade field for a landing strip, and the planes, we had just a shack there for keep some supplies in and all, and the planes were stored, tied down to the ground, because as you know, the wind blows quite hard in the Abilene, and if we didn't tie them down, keep them tied down, well, they'd turn over, the wind would blow them over. And that was the extent of, they were out in the open and all the time. And of course, as I say, we use the parade ground for landing and also for takeoff. And one day we were up flying around just getting some flying time in. Came up quite a storm, up 85 mile an hour wind. Well, those planes wouldn't fly 85 miles an hour. So we finally got back to the airport. We were standing still most of the time. When I got down to the ground, well, the airplane mechanics each grabbed a wing, and we finally got it over and tied down. That was quite a scary time. And some of the fellows went with the wind and landed in another airport until that storm was over. But that was quite an exciting time.
What about Ruby in the summer when she arrives there? What kind of arrangements?
Well, that arrangement was pretty sorry. It was an old candy factory that they had divided into 3 just long sections and put walls in between the 3 sections, and then in each one of those sections they'd put up a wall about 5 feet high to divide one room from the other, and that was our living quarters. And in fact, we had a hard time even getting that. One of our friends was moving out of one, and through the housing officer, well, we were able to get it, and somebody else thought he was entitled to it, so quite a fuss over it. And the rent was pretty steep for what you had. So.
What did you all do during the summer for recreation? What were some of the things you did?
As a family?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had relatives there, quite a number of relatives, Ruby's relatives in Abilene, and we would visit them. Her grandmother was there, lived there, so we spent quite a bit of time that we had off with the relatives. She had an uncle who lives there, and in fact, the uncle lived down in Ovalla. Do you know where Ovalla was? You know, it's just south of Abilene there. And,
what about General Brewer? What was his attitude towards dependents arriving?
Well, really, I don't know what his attitude was. He seemed to be, in fact, I had very little contact with General Brewer. In my whole stay, the time he was with the 12th. I only saw him a couple of times, and that was would be on maneuvers. He never did fly with us or anything. And, like during the war, when we were overseas, well, Colonel Crawford was always wanting to go up and get a first-hand view of the front lines and what was going on. So, and Colonel Brumley, who was CCB commander, he would like to, we took him up quite a number of times during World War II in Germany and France. And
What about Harold Crawford? Do you know what happened to him after the war?
yeah, he's living in Florida. It will have nothing to do with the division. There's been several of the fellows that's gone by and visited him. I have his phone number, his address, home address. See, he got into the 101st
Airborne group.
Airborne group after he left the 12th, and I don't know why. I've written him a couple of personal letters, having flown him as much as I did, and I let him pilot the plane, and because he was a washed-out pilot to start with, and he just won't even answer my letters. So the ones there's been two that I know of that's gone by and visited with him there. He's just not interested in the 12th Armored Division, even though he commanded it all during World War II.
Was he bitter about it? Did he receive those people graciously, or what was their experience with him?
I think he received them very graciously. See, in the meantime, he divorced his wife and married one of the Red Cross girls, I think it was. And right after the war ended over in Germany, well, I flew Colonel Crawford down to Paris. We spent about nearly a week down there. And back, so I had a lot of contact with him during the war and right after the war.
What do you know about the relief of General Brewer? Do you have any information about the details related?
Well, the only thing I have on that is hearsay, and best of my knowledge, he was relieved because of his age. Now that's the information that was passed on to me. Now how true that is, I do not know. And of course, General Allen was assigned to us in New York.
Did you ever have much contact with him?
A good bit.
Did you fly him any at all?
Just a couple of times. Just a couple of times. See, there again, he wanted to see, there was something that he wanted to see from the air up front. And see, from the air, you can get a good view of what's going on down below. And those Germans really did hate to see those spotter planes up there looking down their throats. And a lot of our tanks, when they'd come up to a hill, they'd want to ask us what was just over the hilltop, which we could see whether, and that's what the German tanks used to like to lay in wait just over the hill, waiting for our tanks to come over. And boy, when they would, they'd knock them off, because those 88s would go right through the front of our tanks.
Your observer was in radio contact with the ground. How was that net set up?
Well, it was an FM set. There were 3 stations that we could go over, and we had contact direct with Fire Direction Center. See, we would spot a target out there, and of course we had all these air maps, and we would give the coordinates of the target. And from that, then the Fire Direction Center would plot it, what the elevation would be for the gun and the range on it. And that's how we directed artillery fire from the air. We would give them the exact coordinates from the map of where the target was.
Well, what role did division artillery play within the three individual battalions? How did that work?
Very little. There just wasn't much coordination there. Well, there wasn't any reason for it. I mean,
So the battalions operated individually?
individually. Each battalion was a complete air section within itself, and all three operated just the same. They each had a senior pilot and two planes and two air mechanics and a driver.
Well, of course, the division pulled out of Abilene in September of '44. What happened to you and Ruby and the family once you got word? Sort of give us the breakdown on once word reaches you that you're going to be moving out. How does that affect the
Well,
family?
of course, Ruby had been up there visiting and living with me through August because school was starting in September. And of course, we knew we were leaving in September. So she and our daughter went back to Houston for school starting, and I was just getting ready to get on the train to go to New York for disembarkation and we were scheduled to go to land in Cherbourg, and that's where all of our equipment was headed. And of course, while we were at sea, well, Cherbourg was bombed out completely, so the whole division then had to go into England, and we're scattered over a long, big section of southern England in there. And our main 494th and several others landed at Tidworth Barracks. That's where we were stationed for about 6 weeks, and we received our equipment there, got our planes, and assembled them. That's where we assembled the planes. And then all 9 planes of the division, the artillery planes, flew across the English Channel and landed in France at Rouen.
Now, are these the same planes you had at Barclay?
No, these were new planes.
So you actually left the planes at Barclay that you had?
Right.
And so did you go with the advance group to England, or did you disembark at Camp Shanks with the rest of the division?
I disembarked with the rest of the division because that's where we received our equipment. And as I say, we had to assemble those planes, and of course we wanted to test fly them before we started over the English Channel with them. And of course our mechanics were very capable of assembling them. The wings were off and all such as that, which had to be put on.
Well, tell me a little bit about, before we get into the combat or even the Tidworth period, about the train trip across the country to Camp Shanks and what you did at Camp Shanks while you were waiting for shipment.
Well, we were at Camp Shanks only about 3 days, which didn't give us much time to get our stuff together and get on board ship. One night I did get off and went into New York City, and we went to a movie, and that was the extent of what I did in Camp Shanks. Just attend the movie one night. The rest of the time we were in camp.
What about the train ride up from Texas? What do you remember about that?
Well, very little, other than it took us a long time to get to New York. I think about 4 days or something like that.
What route did you take? I'm under the impression that the division was split up and went several routes.
Right.
Which route were you on?
I was on the one that went through Kansas City and up that way. Now, beyond that, I don't remember the towns. See, we were completely darked out, where we couldn't see out of the train, and actually we didn't know exactly where we were going. I mean, what route we were taking.
What about the facilities on board the train? Were the officers isolated? Did you stay with your unit? What about your mechanics? Were they with you? How did that work?
No, they were not with us. The mechanics were not with us. They were in another section on the train. Of course, we had a berth in there, and that was all. And let's see. To be honest with you, I don't remember too much about that train trip. I don't know why it's so that I do not remember, because I can remember the other things so well on the.
Well, what about the shipping over? What was the ship you went on? What do you remember about the voyage?
Well, on the voyage, of course, I was on the General Bliss, which was a large ship, and we had about 5,000 of our troops on the General Bliss, and it was the flagship of the convoy. I think we had 7 or 8 ships in the convoy, and of course, going over, we would do a lot of zigzagging, so they couldn't track us too well. The subs couldn't, the German subs, so they couldn't track. So it was hot on that ship without many troops in there. Well, that was the main drawback to the ship, but it was a real nice ship. They had it set up to where they had people stacked just on one bunk on top of the other to get 5,000 people on it. And while we were en route to Cherbourg, we got the word that we could not go into Cherbourg, and we had to change course and go into England then. But that was changed after we had left Camp Shanks.
What about accommodations for officers versus enlisted men on the voyage? Do you remember any difference?
Very little difference. Like in war and going to war, the officers didn't really, to me, didn't have much more than the enlisted men. Of course, they did not allow us to really associate. Of course, with my 2 airplane mechanics, I had to have a close association with them, even though they were enlisted men. But we were not supposed to, as you know, go out with enlisted men in any way. So.
What do you remember about landing in England?
Well, it was cold and damp, wet. In fact, it rained nearly all the time we were there. And let's see. Well, that's about the extent of it.
Of course, you're drawing equipment. I guess the rest of the division is too, but you're assembling the aircraft and doing some test flights and that kind of thing. Did you have a chance to do any sightseeing flights, that kind of thing?
Yes, I sure did. I did a lot of flying, just checking my plane out and all. And Johnny King had a brother that was up in northern part of England, and he got permission from Colonel Crawford for me to fly him up there to see his brother, that was quite an experience to fly from southern England up north and northern part of England to take John King up there. And Johnny was really glad to get to see his brother.
Any special problems flying in that part of the world as opposed to where you've been flying in the Midwest?
No, it's about the same. Now, of course, once we got into Germany, France and Germany, where we had mountains, we had terrific updrafts and downdrafts. It was very rough flying in those lightweight planes. In other words, we got a lot of bumps.
What about, did you have the power to get over the ranges, the mountain ranges that you needed to, or were you confined to lower elevations?
No, the ones that, see, we could go up to about 12,000 feet. That's as high as one of those Cub planes would go, and that would clear most of the mountains that we were involved with over there. And of course, if we couldn't go over, we could go down through a canyon.
Well, let's begin our look at combat operations. You get your planes and fly them over the channel. Where do you fly to, and what do you do first?
Well, we flew to Rouen, R-O-W, in France, and from there we went directly into combat. Soon after we landed there, just within days. And of course, see, it was in December when we went across the channel, and see, we went into combat. Can't remember the exact day, but somewhere in mid-December. I know by Christmas Day we were well into combat.
What do you remember about those first days of combat?
Those first days of combat, I was scared to death every time one of those guys was shooting at us. And they'd shoot tracer bullets, and it looked like those tracer bullets were going to hit you right between the eyes. Of course, they were missing us, but that's the way they looked coming up at you, particularly just about dusk in the afternoon. See, we could only fly till dark. After that, we had to be back on the ground because we had no way of navigating at night. Of course, we wouldn't, if we'd had lights, we wouldn't have wanted to use them because they'd really shot us down then. So, they even shot at us right soon after we got into combat with 88s. I've had several of those 88s explode underneath me, and the concussion from the explosion of that shell was terrific on the plane. It would bounce it around quite a bit. So the Germans really hated those spotter planes because, as I say, we were looking right down their throats.
If we could sort of picture a front line of the American position and then the Germans over this line, how did you usually fly your missions? Where did you usually go?
Right after about 2 or 3 weeks of flying, combat flying, we flew beyond the target because our own artillery shells were coming over, and we could see they move at the rate of 1,150 feet per second, which is slow enough that as big as they are, we could see them coming over the nose of our plane. So we started flying all our missions beyond our target. In other words, we were over the enemy territory completely after the first couple of weeks, because we didn't want to be knocked out by our own artillery. And you go to firing a battery of artillery at a target, that's a lot of shells coming through the air where you are.
So the first 2 or 3 weeks you were right along the front line?
Yeah, right along the front lines, and that's when we would see these, when we'd fire our fire mission, we could see these artillery shells coming over us. And
what about loss of aircraft and personnel in enemy territory? Did any of you have any problems with that, being shot down and not making it back?
No, we had one, not in our battalion, but in the 495th Battalion, pilot and observer and plane were shot down and killed. They were shot down behind the German lines.
Of course, I guess it doesn't matter if you're killed, where you're at.
Right. And twice, of course, after my being shot down at Herlesheim, see, I was right over the city of Herlesheim when I was shot down. In fact, looking right down on the target. And we were firing on the target, our artillery on the target. And of course, we're right in the middle of the fire mission when they knocked us out of the air. And then the next 2 times that I was shot down, they shot the whole tail section off of the airplane, and it wouldn't wouldn't fly. So I could land it, get it down on the ground, which was behind the enemy lines, but I did not have an observer with me at that time because it had gotten kind of muddy, the field. I couldn't get off the ground with an observer, so I was having to do the observing and the flying, which is a full-time job. I'll tell you, to do both of them. And to watch out for enemy airplanes firing at us. Then the next time I was shot down, one of the pilots saw me go down and came in and picked me up. So, and the first time that I started to tell you about, I was able to walk out.
The time you were by yourself?
You're right. Because I knew where the Germans were, and so I got out of there in a hurry. I was only about a mile behind the German lines, but...
Well, let's go back and look at Herlesheim then and sort of revisit what you initially told us. During the time before you went down, what's going on in the city? What have you been able to witness?
Well, there was quite a movement of the German troops around in Herlesheim. They had right around 2 crack divisions in Herlesheim. And of course, all the information the 12th Armored Division had was that there was 2 battalions of German troops over there. They knew they were crack troops, but they furnished us the information that it was just a few troops. So we were up trying to find out how many were back there, and that's when we were firing this artillery mission on a bunch of the troops. As we were, well, of course they'd been shooting at us, and we hadn't paid any attention to that because by that time we were used to being shot at all the time while we were up there. You get to where you just don't care about that. And about that time, well, this 20 millimeter popped into our plane in the cockpit and exploded there. So that was on the 15th of January, about 8 o'clock in the morning. Well,
What do you mean that you get to the point where you just don't care?
you get over your fear. You just, after a while, you really get to where you don't care if they hit you or not. I mean, that's the way you get, that's the only way you can keep flying. And that's the way, I guess that's the only way you could keep going as a soldier down on the ground, is you just lose your fear, but you're always scared. You're scared, but you just get to where you just don't care. And let's see.
Well, the shell explodes. What are you aware of immediately once that happens?
Well, of course, the first words Herman says, "They got me," which they had. And of course, he passed out just like that. And because his whole face had flak all in it, all in his legs, shot the muscle off of his right arm.
Could you see that from where you were?
In the plane?
Mm-hmm.
No, because, see, he was directly behind me. In fact, he was sitting, his head was about that far behind mine, and he had this microphone up between us, transmitting that fire mission, and that shell hit that microphone in his hand, knocked it out through the left plexiglass window, and there was just the shape of the microphone where it went out. So that was, and of course, as soon as we weren't very high. Well, there was a low ceiling that day. When you're only flying at 200 or 300 feet, well, it don't take long to get down to the ground. And of course, I was able to control that plane enough. It still had enough control, even though it had holes through the propeller and from that bullet exploding in the cockpit. And some of it went into the engine, but it kept going. And as soon as we hit the ground, well, our troops were right there. And Hayes being one of them.
You know anyone else that was a
No,
part
I
of that rescue
don't.
party?
And I had forgotten about Ed until he mentioned to me.
What were you doing as soon as the plane came to a stop?
Well, of course, I was able to get out where Nast, the structure of the plane, was all bent up, and they had to do some prying to get him out of the plane, and they went immediately filling him with morphine while he was still in the plane, and to get him out of that pain, because he was in terrific pain. But as I say, his first words was, when that bullet exploded, "Maury, they got me." And so, but had I gotten what he did, neither one of us would have been here. So we were both fortunate from that standpoint, even though he got the most of the wound.
What was your status in terms of wounds and stuff from that scrape?
Just flak in my legs. Just flak in my legs.
Nothing in the back of your head?
Not a thing. And how that went around my head and took that windshield out of that plane in front of me, went through the bottom of the plane and blew the tires out. I don't know. It's the most amazing thing I have ever seen. It just, unless you saw it and were there, you just could not believe what all happened.
A pair of glasses you donated to as part of your collection in Abilene. Are those the glasses that Nash was wearing that day?
That's right. See, they were left in the plane, and of course I picked them up and kept them because they had a lot of sentimental value there.
And the piece of shrapnel that you donated, did you get that out of your plane?
Out of the plane, right. See, that shrapnel just went everywhere in that cockpit of that plane. It went through the floorboard, went through the windshield, went through the top of the plane. I did not ever realize that a 20 millimeter could do the damage to one of those planes that did.
You mentioned he was in the hospital for quite a long time. Did he eventually recover from his wounds?
Right, he recovered from his wounds, and got enough of his muscle back in his right arm that he played golf quite a bit. But took a couple of years to do that.
Tell us a little more detail now about those other two times that you went down. The next time where you were alone, you remember what you were doing at the time that the aircraft received the hit?
I was getting ready to fire a fire mission, and apparently they figured that that's what I was going to do. I was behind the lines, which as I say, we always, after the first couple of weeks, we always flew behind the lines when we were firing a fire mission to keep from getting hit by our artillery. And I was just getting ready to give them the coordinates to fire on it, and that's when they shot the whole control system out of the plane. Apparently it broke the control cables. They hit it back of where the pilot was sitting, and then of course, as I say, I was only up a couple of 100 feet because with that low ceiling, that's about all you could get. We had more 200-foot ceilings over there in the wintertime than we had clear weather. Very little clear weather during winter over there. Then the next time that I got shot down, the whole tail section was shot off. Couldn't control the plane at all. So
what happened? How did you get down without?
Well, you have a certain amount of glide because the wings were still intact. It was the whole tail section, but you couldn't level it at all, and I could control it more with the ailerons, and since I'd lost that rudder control, well, you just didn't have any control over the plane, and so it just went down. And
What was the condition of the plane once you got to the ground? Did it break up?
yeah, it broke up quite a bit. Yes.
What happened to you after those three incidents? Take us through the war now.
Well, after the Herlesheim being shot down, they made me take a week's leave and go down to the Riviera, which first after that, right after being shot down, I had to get a replacement plane and fly one mission. They made me do that. Then they cut orders to send me down to the Riviera for a week. And of course, then I took the replacement plane, and flew down there and spent a week. I was going to try to ski, and not being a skier, I never did learn enough to ski, so I just laid around the hotel, and it was nice. A lot of snow down there, peaceful. And then after the week down there, after the time was up, well, I flew back up. I had a pretty hard time finding the 12th Armored Division, but I finally found them. Because one division doesn't know exactly where the other one is, except the one right next to them. And
Well, after the Riviera, about how many more missions do you have to fly till it's over? In other words, what did you do? 175 missions?
Total 175 missions.
How many do you still have yet to do out of that 175 now?
From Herlesheim?
Yeah.
Well, over half of them, yeah, because see, Herlesheim was real early in combat for us. See, that was the 15th of January, and we actually went in combat late December. So see, we hadn't had, of course, we were flying every day. We were flying all the hours of daylight. One plane would go up from a battalion and fly till his gas, he just had enough gas to get back to where our field was. And we'd radio the other plane, he'd take off before we got back to the field and be airborne and up on the front line. So the time we got back to the field, we'd gas up and rest up a few minutes, and we were back ready to go when he put in. See, about 2.5 hours was about as long as we could fly with enough gas to get back. Once or twice I ran low on gas, real low, had to land on the road and waylay a truck. See, we used truck gasoline over there. That created quite a problem because of all that lead that was in that truck gasoline. We would have to pull the heads on those engines every 35 hours of flying time and clean all the carbon out that lead gasoline had formed in there, because it'd get to where, with all that in there, you get to where you didn't have enough power to get off the ground. They'd still run, but no power.
Well, so you're going to have better luck now after Herlesheim. Is that right?
Yeah.
You're not shut down. After those 3 times, you still are encountering a lot of ground fire?
Right, yeah. We encountered ground fire right up to the last day. Right up to the last day. See, ground troops really enjoyed firing their rifles at us. Of course, unless they actually hit you, they couldn't do much damage to the plane, because those rifle bullets would just go right through all that fabric on the plane, and all it'd do is just leave a little hole there for the mechanic to patch.
Well, what could you describe then these last missions through February, March, and April, down through the Colmar Pocket and on into Germany? And
Well, one of the main things that I remember when we went on service with the 3rd Army, no, the 7th Army, which was Patton's.
no, Third Army.
Yeah, 3rd Army. We were 7th Army. We were on, and they called all the pilots and officers up for a briefing by Patton. That's the only time I ever was in contact with him, was when we were 300 miles from the Rhine, and Patton told the whole group that we were 300 miles from the Rhine, and he says, I want you to be there in 3 days, be damned the cost of lives. That's his exact words that he uttered. Of course, I have to agree with him. Getting out and moving that way, you'd lose more of our men, but in the long run, you would save men. I have to agree with him on that, but I would never have made such a statement.
What about the rest of the officers? What was their reaction to that?
Well,
and to Patton?
The ones that I was friendly enough with didn't exactly like it. They were like me. See, it was the pilots and it wasn't the whole officer of the division. It was just certain ones, and of course the pilots having to look for the targets up ahead. Well, he had us up there. And that's the only contact I had with Patton during the World War II.
Well, what happened once you all were attached? You know, this whole business of the mystery division, and
Yeah.
what was Patton's rationale? What did he tell us the story about that?
Well, the reason we were called the Mystery Division was because when we were put on service with Patton's 3rd Army, we had to remove our patches so if we were captured, we had to remove all identification of the 12th Army. So if we're captured or anything, the Germans wouldn't know what division they had gotten. And that was the reason for it. He just didn't want them to know what division, since we'd been fighting further south as the 12th, and the Germans knew where we had been before, and he didn't want them to realize that he'd moved another division up there to march on the Rhine. And we were on the Rhine River in 3 days. If we'd hadn't moved so fast, we'd probably lost more men than we did by moving fast. Because that keeps them, they can't get set to defend themselves when you're moving against them like that. Never letting them stop till you get organized for defense.
Anything else you'd want to add to sort of the description of your ordinary routine operations as a liaison pilot? Anything that we haven't covered that we need to add here?
I really can't think of anything else. That pretty well.
We have a photograph in the 12th Armored Division collection that shows all the 7th Army liaison pilots sitting on a step of a building. They're all smiles. Could you tell us the story behind that pose?
Well, that pose was when they called all the planes in, and that was at the Army Depot. I forget the town, but that's where all the supplies came from and all. That's where we had to turn in our airplanes, and so we all went up there, and we spent the night there. And had quite a party up there, and the Army wanted to take a picture of all the pilots that were there. And that's how that picture came about. The Army took that picture.
And you're in that group?
I'm in that group. I can't locate me right now. I know about where I was, but all the guys I look at, I can't identify myself.
What happens after the war is over for you, for Maurice Glover?
I was declared. I had enough points from all the air medals and everything that I had. I had enough points to come home immediately because they were letting them out by points, and length of service. And of course, length of service counted a certain number of points. But I got it declared essential for the general's pilot. And I consequently stayed in Germany until mid-December.
So this is General Allen?
Mm-hmm.
Did he ever have a conversation with you with regards to why you were chosen?
Well, I guess I was the oldest one of the bunch, and we had a few that was kind of wild, and
The general didn't want to fly with them, huh?
Well, the other pilot, he will tell you himself, or any of the officers of the 494th will tell you the other pilot in the 494th was one of the wildest guys over there. He wrecked a plane a couple of times unnecessarily. He took off one morning when there was frost all over the wing, and you just don't do that because you got no lift on that. And he took out a fence at the end of the runway and tore up that plane. After the war was over, he was flying, and before we turned in our planes, he knocked the center mast post of our service tent, hit it, knocked the tent down. You should have heard Johnny King holler about that.
Well, I can see why the general wouldn't want to fly with him.
Well, some of the others were just about as bad in the other battalions. Now, there's one pilot that stayed in, and we all lost contact with him and didn't know where he was, but I found out a short time back. His name is George Pappas. He's from Indiana. That's where his parents lived, and that's where he entered the Army from. He stayed in the Army after the war was over and finally became a lieutenant colonel, and he just retired a couple of years, 3 years ago, and he's living in El Paso. And that's a man that, he was another one of those like Johnson was, but he's one that if you ever get a chance to interview him, would make a good interview.
You're talking about Lester Johnson,
Yeah,
the the pilot?
Yeah, well, see, Lester was my pilot with the 494th, but Pappas was with the 495th.
Is he a member of the association?
He is now, since I found him out there, and see, I found him in all these cards that I sent out. The address we had was still back in Indiana, and of course his father was the same name, George Pappas, and the card went to him, and I got the hold of the phone number and called up there and got his mother, and she couldn't give me much information on him. She was very senile and way up in her 90s, and I finally got his phone number from her and called him and we got him as a member of the association now.
Oh, that's great.
But he would be a good one to interview. Let's see.
What about those last few months then flying for the general? What were those missions like?
Just sightseeing missions. That's all.
Did you get to know General Allen very well?
No, you really didn't. Because as soon as we get to where we were going, well, he was up and gone, and so it's kind of hard to do much talking while in one of those planes while you're flying. But
what about rotation back to the U.S.? How did that take place then?
well, I finally was released to come back in December. I came back on a Liberty ship in a storm. And, a lot of those Liberty ships broke up in those storms. But it was a little earlier in the year that they were breaking up so much. So I got back soon after, around the 15th of December, just before Christmas. And I was sent to Camp Fanning down at Tyler. That's where I was released from the Army. And of course, they kept me in the Army Reserves. I was in that for about 5 years. So,
Did you do any flying in the reserves?
no, because I went back to a job after the war, and
Do any flying in your sales, calling on
only
customers?
commercial. No, none myself. However, I did get my commercial license. All we had to do as pilots with that number of hours, all we had to do was just take a written exam, and I was issued a commercial license where I could, fly anybody that I wanted to then, commercially.
But you never did?
Never did, no. Well, the main reason was I didn't have the money.
Well, what did you do after the war then?
I went with a firm, and I went in the Army at El Paso. I was a buyer for the American Furniture Company out there. Well, Ruby had been back in Houston with her family, and she really wanted to stay around Houston, so I went with a firm. It was Mohawk Carpet Distributor as salesman for the Houston, Beaumont, Corpus Christi, well, all of South Texas. And then they transferred me to Dallas about a year later in charge of the whole carpet division for all of the points of distribution, which we had them from Louisville, Kentucky to New Orleans and down in Florida. So I was in charge of that for quite a number of years, and then they promoted me to sales manager of all the salesmen, and the salesmen in that distribution they had a lot of other things other than carpet to sell. So, and then in 1956, I decided I'd go out as a manufacturer's representative, and I'd become quite friendly with several of the managers of these furniture companies. So I got a couple of those factories to give me their lines for Texas, and then I went out as a manufacturer's representative in 1956. That's when I started traveling 60,000 miles a year and over Texas. And I finally ended up in Oklahoma and New Mexico in addition to Texas.
What about your connection with the 12th Armored Division Association? Where does that begin?
Well, of course, I didn't know anything about it for a long while. I visited one of my friends, officer friends, up in, I was in Washington, D.C., Dave Weston. He's still a member of the association. He hadn't been to any of the reunions recently. He's doing a lot of church work in foreign countries, and he's gone so much, he and his wife. And we visited with him, and he told me about the association, and that's how I got into the association. That was so. And then the first few years that I was in with the association, they had their meetings in July, and in July I had my Dallas furniture markets here, and that's when you made your living, is being at those furniture markets. So I didn't get to attend the reunions, the national reunions, and they didn't have many chapter meetings at that time. They just began to form them. So when they moved them to in August and September, well, then I started attending the reunions. First thing I was appointed a unit rep for the 494. Did that for 11 years. And of course, I was on the executive council as a unit rep, and that's how I got to know quite a few of the fellows. See, during the war, you didn't really get to know many people outside of just the ones that were right around you. A lot of the officers I did not know, particularly being a pilot. So.
What would you say the role has been of the 12th Armored Association in terms of your life and the impact it's had on dealing with the things that have grown out of World War II, dealing with the realities of what you went through?
Well, I don't really know how to say that. It, being in the association, I got to know a lot of people as friends that I did not know before. And I certainly have enjoyed that friendship throughout the years. And of course, I guess that's the one way I got to be president. I kind of jumped the gun. I didn't go through these you generally start out as a director, serve as director 3 years, and then you go up to second vice president, then first vice president the next year, then on into the presidency. And somehow or other they wanted to nominate me as as first vice president. That's where I started. Then of course the next year, then I became. There were 2 of us that were nominated for first vice presidents, and I was the one that was chosen to become president. And
what do you see as the future of the association? In other words, as the membership grows older and the war recedes more distantly in the past, what's the prognosis, your expectations for what the association might accomplish over the next few years, and how long do you think this will continue as an organization?
well, I think we can accomplish more by really working on the history and promoting that and building that up as much as we can. And as far as the prognosis of how long it'll last, I would say 10 more years is extreme, because of the age of all of the people. The youngest people now are 70 past. Of course, there's a bunch of us that are like myself that are older, good bit older, and with all those 70, when you get beyond 70, gremlin takes you away pretty often. If you'll notice the obituaries, they're increasing every year.
Let me ask you a question then. Every war generation has to face this. Every generation, whether there was a war in their life or not. But when you look at the 12th Armored Division family, what about the next generation? What about the children of the 12th Armored Division? Do you think there's interest in their father's service to the point where they might keep the association alive?
There are a few of them that are quite interested in that, and I do not know whether there would be enough of them to keep it going. That would be the question. Some of them just don't, the children could care less. Now, my grandson is quite interested in the 12th Armored Division. In fact, I took out a lifetime membership for him because he wants to get the material like the Hellcat News and so forth. And he is quite interested and would work in something like promoting it. But he's just one of few. I just do not overall believe there would be enough interest there.
Well, it's never happened before.
No.
In other words, if you go back to the Civil War or the Spanish-American War, those associations that were created died out and ceased to exist. World War I, and most of those are gone now or leaving the scene. But I think World War II is the first war where you have the kind of communication and development of the historical uh, collections. They just didn't have. Other generations just didn't have access to the kind of preservation or the activities, the communication devices that the World War II generation has enjoyed, and so it may well develop into something else. Who knows?
Well, I'd certainly like to see it continue on. What does it say?
Well, do you, looking back over the interview now, do you have anything else that you would like to mention? Thinking back of people that you encountered during the war, or since the war, for that matter, observations about those people or those events that you haven't talked about that you would like to maybe put on the record at this point?